middle of each day, when the sun reached its highest point and the world pressed forward with its relentless demands, Albert Einstein would do something that his colleagues found strange, something that the culture around him viewed with suspicion, something that went against every principle of productivity and efficiency that governed academic life in the 20th century. He would stop, would close the door to his study, would leave equations half-finished on the chalkboard, would ignore the letters piling up on his desk, would turn away from everything that screamed for his attention, and would retreat to a quiet room where a couch waited. It is said that Einstein guarded this hour more fiercely than he guarded anything else in his life, would refuse meetings scheduled during this time, would not take phone calls, would not see visitors, no matter how important they claimed to be. This hour, this single hour in the middle of each afternoon, was sacred, was protected, was non-negotiable. The ritual never varied. 1 o'clock would arrive, or sometimes 1:30. The exact time mattered less than the consistency. What mattered was that every day, at roughly the same hour, Einstein would feel the pull toward rest, would recognize that the morning's work had accumulated questions that could not be answered through more work. That consciousness needed to release its grip, that the mind required surrender. He would enter the room where rest waited, would close the door behind him with deliberate care. The sound of the latch clicking was the sound of separation, of leaving the ordinary world behind, of creating boundary between the productive self that others saw and the resting self that only he knew. Whispers tell us that the room itself was simple, not elaborately decorated, not filled with the symbols of achievement or status, just a room with a couch, with curtains that could be drawn to dim the afternoon light, with quiet that felt deeper than mere absence of noise. The simplicity was essential, was part of what made rest possible. Too much decoration would have been distraction. Too much beauty would have demanded attention. The room's plainness allowed consciousness to turn inward without external interference. Einstein would approach the couch with something like reverence, not rushing, not casual, moving with the deliberateness of someone performing ceremony. He understood that this was not ordinary rest, was not the careless nap that tired people take without intention. This was practice, was the daily engagement with consciousness itself, was the hour when he would deliberately loosen the mind's grip and see what that loosening revealed. He would lie down in a particular position, always the same position, on his back, head supported by a cushion, arms either folded across his chest or positioned at his sides, and in one hand, the right hand usually, though sometimes the left, he would hold an object, a spoon, or a key, or any small piece of metal that had weight enough to be felt, but not so much weight that holding it required effort. This object was essential to the practice, was the instrument through which Einstein measured the exact depth of rest he sought. He would position his hand above the floor or above a metal plate placed beside the couch, and he would hold the object loosely, gently, just firmly enough to maintain grip while fully awake, but not so firmly that muscle tension would persist as sleep approached. Beneath the silence of the room, the process would begin. Einstein lying still, eyes closed, breath slowing, the object held in suspended grip, and consciousness beginning its descent from the bright clarity of waking thought into the shadowed territory of sleep. But this descent was not meant to be complete. That was the genius of the spoon. That was why Einstein had developed this particular method. He did not want deep sleep, did not want the surrender that comes in the middle of night when consciousness dissolves entirely and dreams take over with their own strange logic. He wanted something more precise, more subtle. He wanted the edge, the boundary, the exact moment when waking thought began to dissolve, but had not yet fully disappeared. Some believe Einstein discovered this method through experimentation, through years of noticing that insights often came not during intense focus, but during rest. Not through conscious effort, but through the relaxation that followed effort. He had learned or intuited, or somehow knew that there was a particular state of consciousness that was neither fully awake nor fully asleep. A liminal space, a threshold, and in that space, understanding became possible that was impossible in either full waking or full sleep. The spoon was the key to accessing this space. As Einstein's body relaxed and sleep approached, the muscles in his hand would begin to release their grip. Gradually, incrementally, the object would become heavier as the hand's strength faded, and at a certain point at the exact moment when consciousness crossed from waking into the first stage of sleep, the hand would open completely and the object would fall. The sound metal striking metal, or metal striking floor, would penetrate the thin veil of sleep, would pull Einstein back, would wake him at precisely the moment when he had crossed the threshold he sought to study, and he would lie there, newly awakened, still carrying the residue of where he had been, still holding in consciousness the images and sensations and strange knowing that lived in the space between waking and sleep, where memory fades into mystery question remains. What did Einstein experience in these moments? What did he find in the stolen hour? He spoke of it rarely, described it in letters as essential to his work, but did not elaborate on what occurred there. Perhaps because language could not capture it. Perhaps because what happened in those moments lived in a realm beyond words, in the territory where consciousness encounters itself without the mediation of rational thought. Marked by the moon, though it was afternoon, and moon was invisible, Einstein kept this daily vigil with rest, kept this appointment with the unconscious, kept this practice that made no sense to observers, but that made perfect sense to him because he knew what it yielded, knew that the morning's questions would be answered not through more work, but through surrender, knew that the problems that seemed intractable while awake would clarify in the space between waking and sleep, knew that consciousness, given permission to release control, would reorganize itself, would make connections that effort had prevented, would find solutions that seeking had obscured. It is said that visitors to Einstein's home would sometimes ask about the practice, would wonder why a man of such genius would waste an hour each day sleeping when there was so much work to be done, so many problems to solve, so much that demanded his attention. And Einstein would smile, would not explain fully because full explanation was impossible, would simply say that the rest was necessary, that the hour was not stolen from work, but was work itself, that what he discovered lying on that couch contributed more to his physics than many hours spent at the chalkboard. The afternoon would deepen. Einstein would lie still with the spoon in his hand, and consciousness would begin its descent toward the threshold, toward the moment when the object would fall and the sound would mark the boundary between worlds, toward the stolen hour that was not stolen at all, but was gift, was offering, was the practice that taught him what waking consciousness alone could never teach, that understanding requires surrender, that insight comes through release, that the deepest knowing lives not in the bright certainty of waking thought, but in the shadowed uncertainty of the space between waking and sleep, where nothing is fixed and everything is possible, and the mind, finally free of its own demands, can see what it could not see while it was trying so hard to see. The hour was sacred. The practice was essential. And Einstein, lying on his couch with a spoon poised to fall, was not resting from work, but was engaging in the work that made all other work possible, was not interrupting his thinking, but was thinking in a way that only rest allowed, was not stealing time, but was investing it in the practice that would yield understanding beyond what what any amount of wakeful effort could produce. The spoon would fall, the sound would echo, and Einstein would wake carrying something from the other side, something he could not name but could feel, something that would show up later in his equations, in his insights, in his capacity to see the universe differently than anyone had seen it before. The stolen hour giving its gift, the afternoon rest revealing its wisdom, the practice proving once again that surrender is not opposite of achievement, but its foundation. There was a piece of furniture in Albert Einstein's home that witnessed more breakthroughs than any blackboard or laboratory ever did. Not a desk where calculations were performed, not a chair where contemplation occurred, but a couch, a simple, worn piece of furniture with cushions that had long since molded themselves to the shape of his body. A couch that had become, through years of devoted use, something more than furniture, had become instrument, had become tool, had become the sacred space where understanding gestated in darkness before emerging into the light of conscious thought. It is said that if you could have seen this couch, really seen it, not just looked at it, but perceived what it had absorbed through thousands of hours of use, you would have understood something essential about how genius works, about how insights arrive, about the relationship between rest and revelation that Einstein had discovered through practice, but that most people never learn. The couch was not beautiful, was not the kind of furniture that would draw attention or admiration. The upholstery had faded from whatever color it had once been to a nondescript beige or gray. The fabric showed wear in the places where Einstein's body contacted it most frequently. The cushions were compressed, flattened, holding the permanent impression of his form like the couch itself had learned the geography of his resting body and shaped itself to receive him. There were stains, coffee perhaps, or ink from the pen he would sometimes hold during the twilight moments of waking. Small tears where the fabric had worn thin, the wooden frame visible in places where upholstery had pulled away. All the signs of an object that had been used not decoratively, but functionally, not displayed, but inhabited, not preserved, but worn smooth through devoted practice. Whispers tell us that Einstein's colleagues who visited his home would sometimes be surprised by this couch, would expect something grander, something that reflected his status, his achievements, his place in the pantheon of great scientists, but they would find instead this humble piece of furniture, this worn couch that looked like it belonged in any ordinary home. And they would not understand, could not understand, unless they too had kept vigil with rest, that ordinariness was essential. That humility of the object allowed extraordinary things to occur there. The couch asked nothing of whoever lay upon it, made no demands, required no particular posture or positioning except what comfort dictated. It was support without imposition, structure without rigidity, the perfect instrument for practice that required surrender because it surrendered itself completely to whoever used it. Beneath the silence of countless afternoons, this couch had held Einstein's sleeping form, had supported his body while his consciousness traveled to territories that waking thought could not access, had been present for breakthroughs that would change human understanding of reality itself. And though the couch knew nothing, was merely fabric and wood and springs, it had participated nonetheless, had been essential component of the practice that made insight possible. Some believe that certain objects absorb something of what occurs near them. That furniture used for sacred purpose becomes itself somehow sacred. That the couch, having held Einstein through thousands of hours of rest and revelation, carried some residue of those hours, some trace, some echo of the consciousness that had inhabited it so completely and so regularly. Visitors who sat on this couch, and some did, unaware of what they were sitting on, would sometimes report feeling strange, restless, as if they should not be there, as if they were intruding on space that belonged to someone else even when that someone was not present. The couch held claim, had been consecrated by use into territory that was not quite public even when it existed in a room where guests were welcomed. Where memory fades into presence, the couch existed not just as object, but as witness. It had been there for specific moments, for afternoons when Einstein would wake from his rest with sudden clarity, would leap up ignoring the stiffness in his joints, ignoring the disorientation of sudden waking, and would rush to his study to capture the insight that had arrived during sleep before it could fade back into the unconscious from which it had emerged. The couch had been there for the afternoons when no insight came, when Einstein would wake disappointed, when the spoon would fall and consciousness would return, but would carry nothing from the other side except the ordinary confusion of interrupted sleep. These afternoons, too, were part of the practice, were evidence that rest did not guarantee revelation, that surrender did not always yield understanding, that the practice was practice precisely because results were not guaranteed, but effort was still required. Marked by the moon that moved invisibly beyond the walls, the couch marked time not in hours, but in accumulations, in the slow wearing away of fabric, in the gradual compression of cushions, in the stains and tears that recorded not specific moments, but the sum of all moments. The couch was archive, was record, was the physical manifestation of devoted practice extending across decades. It is said that Einstein developed particular relationship with this couch, that it was not just furniture he used, but companion he trusted. That lying down there each afternoon was not just physical act, but emotional return. Like coming home, like reunion with something familiar and reliable and safe. The couch received him without judgment, without expectation, without demanding that he be anything other than what he was in that moment: tired, seeking rest, hoping for insight, but willing to accept whatever came. The relationship between Einstein and his couch was, in its way, a kind of love. Not romantic love, not the love of human relationship, but the love that develops between human and object when that object serves essential function across long time. The love of the craftsman for his tools, the love of the musician for his instrument, the love of the practitioner for the physical thing that makes practice possible. Einstein trusted this couch, trusted that it would support him, trusted that lying there would create conditions for insight. And the couch, in its mute and object way, fulfilled that trust, was always there, always ready, always offering its surface for Einstein to rest upon, and its silent witness to whatever would occur during the hour of rest. Beneath the silence of the room, the couch waited, day after day, year after year, decade after decade, waiting for 1 o'clock or 1:30 when Einstein would arrive and lie down and position the spoon and close his eyes, waiting to receive his body, waiting to participate once more in the practice that made it more than furniture, that made it essential component of the process through which one human mind discovered truths that changed how all humans understand the universe. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen, and some objects become more than what they are through the use we make of them. The couch in Einstein's home was ordinary furniture, was mass-produced object with no inherent meaning or value beyond its utility. But through devoted use, through Einstein's daily practice of rest, through thousands of hours of holding his sleeping form, while consciousness traveled to places that yield understanding, that ordinary couch became extraordinary. It held equations before they were written, held insights before they were articulated, held the unconscious processing that would later manifest as conscious breakthrough. The couch was laboratory where experiments in consciousness occurred. Threshold where Einstein crossed daily from waking to sleep and back again. Was instrument as essential to his physics as any telescope or particle accelerator, because it was instrument that made his mind capable of perceiving what telescopes and accelerators would later confirm. The couch endured, was there for the early insights that led to special relativity, was there for the years of work on general relativity, was there for the quantum debates, was there for all of it, silent, patient, receiving Einstein's body and supporting his rest and participating in the practice that made everything else possible. And when Einstein's practice finally ended, when age and illness made the afternoon siesta impossible, when the careful calibration he had maintained for decades became too difficult, when the body could no longer support what the mind still desired, the couch remained. Empty now, no longer holding sleeping genius, no longer participating in daily practice, just furniture again, just cushions and fabric and frame, but carrying still in the wear of its upholstery, in the compression of its cushions, in the shape it had learned the record of what had occurred there. The proof that understanding requires not just effort but rest, not just waking work but sleeping wisdom, not just the conscious mind's labor but the unconscious mind's mysterious gift that arrives only when we lie down, close our eyes, and trust that surrender will teach what striving never could. The method was precise, was scientific even in its approach to rest. Albert Einstein, the man who had taught humanity to measure space and time with unprecedented accuracy, applied that same precision to the measurement of his own consciousness. He would lie down each afternoon with an object held loosely in his hand, a spoon or a key or any small piece of metal that had sufficient weight to be felt, but not so much weight that holding it required conscious effort. It is said that Einstein did not invent this technique, that it belonged to a longer tradition of those who sought to navigate the boundary between waking and sleep. But he perfected it, made it his own, understood its purpose with the clarity that comes from practice repeated thousands of times across decades of devoted attention. The object itself mattered less than its function. What mattered was that it could be held. That holding, it required some slight engagement of muscle and will, that as consciousness descended toward sleep, as the body relaxed into deeper and deeper release, the hand's grip would gradually weaken until, at a specific threshold, The fingers would no longer maintain their hold, and the object would fall. The sound metal striking metal if he had positioned a plate beneath his hand, or metal striking floor if the surface was bare, would penetrate the thin veil of beginning sleep, would pull him back, would mark the exact moment when he had crossed from waking into the first stage of unconsciousness, would wake him at precisely the threshold he sought to explore. Whispers tell us that Einstein positioned this arrangement with care each afternoon, would lie down on his couch in the position that years of practice had taught him was most conducive to rest, would arrange the cushions just so, would adjust his body until comfort was achieved, and then would take the spoon or key, or whatever object he was using that day, and would hold it in his right hand, extended slightly beyond the edge of the couch, positioned above the metal plate he had placed on the floor beside him. The positioning required precision. Too far from the edge and his arm would grow tired before sleep arrived, would create discomfort that prevented rest. Too close to his body, and the falling object might not make sufficient sound to wake him. The distance had to be exact, had to allow the arm to rest naturally, while still positioning the object where its fall would be audible. This was Einstein applying physics to consciousness, was him understanding that the body and mind were systems that could be measured, could be calibrated, could be approached with the same rigor he brought to his study of the universe. The spoon was instrument, was tool, was the device through which he could mark and measure the invisible boundary between waking and sleep. Beneath the silence of his afternoon rest, Einstein would feel the transition beginning, would feel thoughts that had been sharp becoming fuzzy, would feel the body's weight increasing as muscle tension released, would feel consciousness beginning its descent from the bright clarity of waking into the shadowed territory that precedes sleep. His attention would narrow, would focus on the sensation of the spoon in his hand, on the slight weight of it, on the pressure of metal against skin. This attention was not effort, was not gripping harder or trying to stay awake, was simply awareness, was gentle tracking of the sensation as it changed, as the hand that held the spoon began its gradual relaxation toward release. Some believe that this attention itself, this gentle awareness of the transition occurring, was what gave Einstein access to insights that others missed. That by tracking his own descent into sleep, by remaining aware, even as awareness began to dissolve, he was training himself to inhabit the threshold, to exist in the space between waking and sleep that most people pass through too quickly to notice, let alone study. the grip would weaken. The spoon would become heavier, or seem to become heavier, as the hand's strength faded. Einstein's breathing would slow, would deepen, would take on the rhythm of sleep, even though sleep had not yet fully claimed him. His mind would begin producing images, abstract shapes, geometric patterns, sometimes fragments of equations, sometimes just light and shadow moving in ways that had no waking logic, but that carried nonetheless some quality of significance, of meaning that could not be articulated but could be felt. And then at the precise moment when consciousness crossed the threshold, when the first stage of sleep began, when the waking mind released its grip, and the dreaming mind had not yet taken over the hand would open, the spoon would fall, the sound would shatter the silence. Where memory fades into waking, Einstein would return, would surface from the depth he had just entered, would open his eyes to the familiar room, the afternoon light, the awareness that he had crossed the boundary and returned. The journey had been brief, had lasted only seconds, but in those seconds something had occurred, some shift, some loosening of the structures that organize waking thought, some access to ways of thinking that ordinary consciousness could not achieve. Marked by the moon he could not see, Einstein would lie still for a moment after waking, would not immediately rise, would let himself remain in the liminal space, would try to hold on to whatever he had experienced in those few seconds of crossing, would try to capture it before full waking consciousness reasserted itself and dismissed as nonsense what had felt significant in the threshold. Sometimes he would remember images, would recall the geometric patterns that had appeared, would recognize in them relationships he had not seen before, connections between concepts that waking thought had kept separate, but that the threshold consciousness had revealed as unified. These images would inform his later work, would show up in his physics as insights that seemed to come from nowhere, but that actually came from the threshold, from the space the spoon marked each afternoon. It is said that Einstein tried different objects over the years, would experiment with weight and shape, would notice that a heavier spoon allowed longer descent before falling, that a lighter key would fall sooner, marking a shallower threshold, that the material mattered smooth metal felt different than rough, cold different than warm, and these differences affected how consciousness tracked the transition. But always the principle remained the same. Hold something that will fall. Position it to make sound. Use that sound to mark the boundary. Use that boundary to study consciousness itself. Use that study to access understanding that waking thought alone could never reach. The practice was elegant, was simple, was accessible to anyone who would try it. Yet Einstein seemed to be one of few who understood its full potential, who recognized that the spoon was not measuring sleep, but measuring consciousness, that the fall was not interrupting rest, but marking discovery, that the sound was not ending the practice, but fulfilling its purpose. Beneath the silence that would return after the spoon's fall had echoed and faded, Einstein would eventually rise, would gather himself, would return to his study carrying what the threshold had given him, would approach his equations with understanding refreshed by rest, with perspective shifted by the journey to the edge of sleep and back, with insights that had arrived not through conscious effort, but through the conscious surrender that the spoon's fall had made possible. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen, and some instruments teach not through what they measure, but through the act of measurement itself. The spoon in Einstein's hand was measuring the threshold between waking and sleep. But in measuring it, in marking it with sound each afternoon, the spoon was also teaching, was training consciousness to recognize that threshold, to inhabit it, to learn from it, to discover that genius lives not in the bright clarity of full waking or the deep surrender of full sleep, but in the space between the threshold where the spoon falls and consciousness, balanced precisely between two states, can see what neither state alone could reveal. The spoon would fall thousands of times across decades of practice, each fall marking one more crossing, one more journey to the threshold and back, one more opportunity for insight to arrive in the space where waking meets sleep and neither claims complete dominion. The vigilant fall, the sacred sound, the marker of the boundary where Einstein discovered what the waking world alone could never teach, that consciousness has layers, has depths, has territories that can only be accessed through surrender, and that the spoon, falling afternoon after afternoon, was not measuring rest, but measuring the dimensions of awareness itself. There were mornings when Albert Einstein would wake from sleep and immediately reach for paper, would write frantically, as if transcribing something that was already beginning to fade, would capture fragments of dreams before they could dissolve back into the unconscious from which they had emerged. Dreams that seemed to contain not narrative, but structure, not story, but mathematics, not the familiar logic of waking thought, but something else, something that spoke in the language of physics while using the grammar of sleep. It is said that one particular dream haunted Einstein throughout his life, came to him when he was young, 16 or 17 perhaps, still in Switzerland, still years away from the theories that would make him famous. He dreamed he was riding a sled down a mountainside at night, dreamed of accelerating, of going faster and faster, of approaching speeds that no sled could actually reach. And in the dream, as velocity increased, the stars began to change, began to shift in their appearance, began to transform in ways that defied ordinary physics, but that made perfect sense in the dream's logic. He woke from that dream changed, woke carrying the image of starlight transforming, woke with the understanding not yet articulated, not yet mathematically precise, but felt nonetheless that motion and light were connected in ways that classical physics did not describe. That velocity changed how light appeared. That speed and perception were linked. That the universe behaved differently than anyone had imagined. This dream, Einstein would later claim, contained the seed of special relativity, contained the insight that would, 20 years later, be refined into the equations showing that space and time were not absolute, but relative. That the speed of light was constant, but that time itself was variable. That moving clocks ran slow, and moving objects contracted, and that the universe was far stranger and more beautiful than Newton had ever suspected. Whispers tell us that Einstein learned early to pay attention to dreams, learned that the sleeping mind could perceive what the waking mind missed, that dreams were not random noise, not meaningless fragments, but communications from the unconscious, messages from the part of himself that worked on problems while he slept, that saw connections while his waking self was too busy analyzing to notice the patterns that only became visible when analysis ceased. His afternoon siestas became, over time, opportunities to cultivate this relationship with dreams. Not the deep dreams of night sleep, those were different, were longer, were harder to remember or control, but the shallow dreams of afternoon rest, the hypnagogic visions that appeared in the threshold between waking and sleep. These dreams were more accessible, more controllable, could be entered deliberately and exited at will when the spoon fell and the sound pulled him back to waking. Beneath the silence of his afternoon rest, Einstein would feel dreams beginning, would feel the shift from directed thought to image, from logical progression to symbolic representation, from the waking mind's linear reasoning to the dreaming mind's simultaneous apprehension of multiple meanings, multiple connections, multiple truths existing in superposition. until observation collapsed them into single understanding. The images that appeared were often geometric: circles, spirals, lines curving in impossible ways, grids that stretched and distorted, planes that folded through dimensions that waking thought insisted could not exist. Einstein experienced these images not as abstract decoration, but as communication, as the unconscious mind's way of showing him relationships that could not be easily expressed in words or equations, but that could be seen, could be felt, could be known directly without the mediation of symbolic representation. Some believe these geometric visions were Einstein's mind processing the mathematics he worked with while awake, that the curves and spirals were space-time itself, rendered visible in dreams, that his unconscious was showing him directly what his equations described symbolically, letting him see the reality that the mathematics pointed toward, but could not fully capture. But Einstein understood them differently, understood that the dreams were not just visualizing what he already knew, but were showing him what he didn't know yet, were revealing connections he hadn't made, were displaying patterns he hadn't noticed, were teaching him through image what logic alone could not teach. Where memory fades into vision, the afternoon dreams would sometimes contain specific insights. Einstein would see, in dream, a solution to a problem he had been wrestling with for weeks, would watch the geometric shapes arrange themselves in a pattern that answered a question his waking work had left unresolved, would understand in the direct, wordless way that only dreams allow something that would take hours or days to translate back into the language of mathematics once he woke. He learned to trust these dreams, learned to believe what they showed him even when it contradicted his waking intuitions, learned that the unconscious mind was not inferior to the conscious mind, but was differently intelligent, had access to different data, could process information in different ways, could see from perspectives that waking consciousness, locked into its habitual patterns, could not access, marked by the moon that governed not just night, but also the tides of consciousness. Einstein's relationship with his dreams deepened over decades. He learned to incubate them, learned to pose questions before lying down for his afternoon rest, would work on a problem all morning, would push it as far as conscious thought could push it, and then would deliberately stop, would lie down with the problem still unresolved, would carry the question into the threshold between waking and sleep, and would see what answer the dreams provided. Often the answer was not complete, was not fully formed, was fragmentary, was image or sensation, or the feeling of rightness about a particular approach that could not be justified through logic, but that Einstein learned to trust. He would wake with this fragment, would write it down quickly before forgetting, and then would spend days or weeks or months translating it, converting the dream insight into mathematical language, making explicit what the dream had shown implicitly. It is said that some of Einstein's colleagues were skeptical of this method, thought it unscientific, thought physics should proceed through rigorous logic and experimental verification, not through dreams and intuitions. But Einstein understood something they did not. Understood that science was not just logic and experiment, was also imagination, was also vision, was also the capacity to see what had never been seen before. And that capacity required accessing states of consciousness where ordinary seeing was suspended and different kinds of perception became possible. The dreams that spoke physics were not speaking in equations, were not presenting proofs, were showing rather than telling, were revealing through image and sensation, and the strange certainty that only dreams provide the feeling of knowing something without knowing how you know it, without being able to justify the knowledge through rational argument, but knowing nonetheless with a conviction that feels absolute even if evidence is absent. Einstein learned to work with this kind of knowing, learned to receive it from dreams without immediately demanding that it make logical sense, learned to hold it gently, to let it exist in its dream form long enough to be felt, to be absorbed, before the work of translation began, before the dream insight had to be converted into the language of waking thought, into the mathematics that could be written down, could be verified, could be communicated to others who did not dream the same dreams, but could follow the logical progression of equations. Beneath the silence of countless afternoon rests, the dreams accumulated. Some were vivid, some vague, some memorable, some forgotten immediately upon waking. But all of them were part of the process. All of them were Einstein's unconscious mind working on problems that his conscious mind had not yet solved, processing data, making connections, seeing patterns, doing the work that only happens when consciousness releases its grip and allows deeper processes to function without interference. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen, and some truths can only be perceived when the rational mind stops insisting on rational explanation. Einstein's dreams spoke physics because Einstein had trained himself to listen to dreams. had given them authority, had created conditions through his afternoon practice of rest where dreams could emerge regularly, could be remembered, could be honored as valid sources of insight rather than dismissed as irrelevant fantasy. The sled racing down the mountainside, the stars transforming, the geometric shapes arranging themselves in patterns that revealed the curvature of space-time. The sudden understanding that energy and mass were equivalent, that matter was frozen light, that the universe was not the static stage Newton had described, but was dynamic, responsive, curved by the presence of mass, distorted by velocity, stranger, and more wonderful than human imagination had previously conceived. All of this, or much of it, or enough of it to matter, came from dreams, from the sleeping mind's capacity to see what the waking mind could not, from Einstein's willingness to lie down each afternoon, to hold the spoon, to cross the threshold into the territory where dreams live, to receive what they offered, and to trust that what seemed nonsensical in dream logic might reveal itself as profound truth once translated into the language of physics. The dreams spoke. Einstein listened, and through that conversation between waking and sleeping, between conscious analysis and unconscious synthesis, between the rational mind that demanded proof and the dreaming mind that simply showed what was there to be seen through that conversation, physics itself was transformed. The universe revealed itself differently. Space and time became relative. Energy and mass became interchangeable, and humanity's understanding of reality itself shifted because one man had learned to pay attention to dreams, to honor what they showed him, to trust that the sleeping mind was not abandoning truth, but was approaching truth from angles that the waking mind alone could never access. The afternoon rest continued. The spoon fell. The dreams arrived. And physics, the science that claimed to be most rational, most rigorous, most dependent on logic and experiment, advanced because a physicist had learned to dream, had learned to listen to dreams, had learned that some truths about the universe could only be perceived when consciousness crossed the threshold into sleep and encountered reality directly, without the mediation of waking thought's categories and assumptions, seeing what was actually there rather than what logic insisted should be there. There was something essential about the timing. Not just that Albert Einstein rested each day, not just that he used the spoon technique to mark the threshold, but that he did this in the afternoon, at the specific hour when the sun had reached its peak and begun its descent. When the day was not beginning and not ending, but suspended in the middle. When the morning's work had accumulated questions and the evening's work had not yet begun to answer them. It is said that Einstein tried, at various points in his life, to adjust this timing, to rest at other hours, to see if the practice would yield the same results if performed in the morning before work began, or late at night before sleep. But something was different. The insights didn't come with the same clarity. The dreams didn't speak with the same precision. The afternoon hour held something that no other hour contained. Perhaps it was the circadian rhythm, the natural dip in alertness that occurs in early afternoon. The way the body, independent of conscious will, begins to slow down between 1 and 3 p.m., begins to signal that rest is needed. That consciousness requires pause. That continuing to push through this natural rhythm comes at a cost, a loss of clarity, a diminishing of attention, a fatigue that accumulates if ignored. Einstein did not ignore this signal, did not fight it with coffee or stimulation, or the force of will that insists rest is weakness. He honored it, treated it not as inconvenience, but as opportunity. Understood that the body's demand for afternoon rest was not obstacle to overcome, but resource to utilize. That the natural drowsiness was gateway to the threshold states that yielded insight. Whispers tell us that the afternoon rest served a specific function in Einstein's creative process. The mornings were for work, for conscious effort, for pushing problems as far as logic could push them, for writing equations, for checking calculations, for the grinding, necessary labor of mathematical physics. He would work intensely from whenever he woke until noon or shortly after, would fill pages, would develop arguments, would pursue lines of reasoning to their conclusions. And then he would stop, not because the work was finished, not because he had reached a natural endpoint, but because he had reached the limit of what conscious effort could achieve in one session, because the problems had become tangled, because the equations weren't cooperating, because he had pushed thought as far as pushing could take it, and further pushing would only create frustration without producing progress. This was when rest became necessary, not as escape from work, but as continuation of work by other means. The morning had filled his mind with questions, had created a kind of pressure, had loaded the unconscious with data that needed processing. And the afternoon rest was when that processing occurred, was when the unconscious mind, given permission to work without conscious interference, could organize, could synthesize, could find patterns that logic alone had missed. Beneath the silence of his afternoon rest, Einstein's mind was anything but idle, was working. Just not in the way that work usually feels. Not through effort, not through concentration, but through the relaxation that allows deeper processes to function. Through the surrender that lets the unconscious do what it does best: make connections, see patterns, find solutions that the conscious mind had been blocking through its insistent effort. Some believe this is why the afternoon timing was essential, because it came after morning work, because it followed effort, because it allowed the unconscious to process specifically what the conscious mind had been working on most recently. If Einstein had rested before working, the unconscious would have had nothing to process. If he had rested only at night, the gap between effort and processing would have been too large, too filled with other activities, other thoughts. But the afternoon rest came immediately after morning work, created direct connection. Let the unconscious pick up precisely where the conscious had left off. Where memory fades into rhythm, Einstein's days developed a structure that reflected this understanding. Morning, effort. Afternoon, rest. Evening, harvest. The three phases working together. The morning creating questions. The afternoon processing them. The evening receiving answers in the form of insights that seemed to come from nowhere, but that actually came from the afternoon's unconscious work. He would wake from his afternoon, rest the spoon having fallen, the threshold having been crossed and marked, and would often feel disappointed, would feel that nothing had happened, that the rest had been only rest, that no insights had arrived, that the hour had been wasted. But then evening would come, and he would return to his study, would look at the morning's equations, and would suddenly see what he hadn't seen before, would notice an error he had missed, would recognize a connection that had been invisible, would understand how to proceed when morning self had been completely stuck. The afternoon rest had done its work, just not in the way he could track while it was happening. The unconscious processing was invisible. Only its results were visible, the insights that emerged hours later, seeming spontaneous, but actually prepared by the rest that had seemed to yield nothing. Marked by the moon that measured not just night, but the larger rhythms of life itself, Einstein's afternoon practice became part of the architecture of his days. Was not interruption, but essential structure. Was not time stolen from productivity, but time invested in productivity's deeper processes. Was the pause that made continuation possible. the rest that made work sustainable across decades rather than burning out in months. It is said that Einstein's colleagues, who did not maintain similar practices, would often hit walls, would work intensely for weeks or months, and then suddenly find themselves unable to think, unable to generate new ideas, exhausted by the relentless pushing that left no room for rest, no time for the unconscious to do its work, no space for insights to emerge from the processing that only happens when conscious effort ceases. But Einstein, with his daily afternoon rest, maintained a different rhythm, could work intensely in the mornings because he knew rest was coming, could push hard because he knew he would stop, could fill his mind with questions because he would give those questions to the unconscious to process. The sustainability of his creative output across decades was not despite the afternoon rest, but because of it, was not achieved by working more hours, but by working with the natural rhythms of consciousness rather than against them. The hour between noon and knowing was not empty, was not wasted, was not absence of work, was different kind of work, was the work the unconscious does when given permission and space and the specific material that morning effort had provided, was the processing that happens in darkness, the connections made in silence, the insights gestating in the territory where consciousness has released control and deeper wisdom can finally be heard. Beneath the silence of countless afternoons, this rhythm persisted. Morning work, afternoon rest, evening harvest, the structure repeating, the practice continuing, the hour between noon and knowing yielding its gifts day after day, year after year, decade after decade. Not because the hour itself was magical, not because the timing had some mystical significance, but because Einstein had discovered through practice, through attention, through decades of experimentation with his own consciousness, that the afternoon hour was when the body naturally requested rest, and when rest yielded the most valuable returns. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen, and some rhythms can only be found when we stop imposing arbitrary schedules and start paying attention to what the body and mind are requesting. Einstein's afternoon rest was not discipline imposed from outside, but rhythm discovered from within, was not forcing himself to rest, but honoring the natural pause that wanted to occur, was not interrupting work, but structuring work around the understanding that consciousness has its own needs, its own rhythms, its own perfect timing that cannot be improved by ignoring it, and can only be honored by following it wherever it leads. The hour arrived each day. The rest was taken. The knowing emerged. And Einstein, lying on his couch while the afternoon sun traced its arc across the sky, was not wasting time, but was investing it in the practice that made his genius sustainable, that kept his creativity flowing across decades, that allowed him to produce not just one breakthrough, but many, not just one insight, but thousands, because he understood that between noon and knowing there must be rest. There must be the pause. There must be the hour when consciousness surrenders and lets the deeper processes function. When the unconscious is given space to do what only it can do. When the body's request for rest is honored as the wisdom it is, rather than dismissed as the weakness it is not. Albert Einstein kept these afternoon hours alone. This was not negotiable, not flexible, not something he would compromise on even for companions he loved, even for Simone, who would have joined him gladly, even for friends who understood the practice and wanted to participate in it. The rest had to be solitary, had to occur in complete aloneness, because solitude was not just absence of others, but presence of something else, something that could only emerge when consciousness was not being shaped or influenced or observed by anyone except itself. It is said that Einstein would close the door to the room where he rested with particular deliberation, would turn the handle carefully, would ensure the latch clicked completely closed. The sound of the door closing was the sound of separation, of creating boundary between the social world and the inner world, between the Einstein that others knew and the Einstein that only he knew, between public self and private consciousness. Behind that closed door, in the room where afternoon light filtered through curtains, something would change. The persona Einstein maintained in the world, the brilliant physicist, the professor, the public intellectual, would fall away, would be shed like costume after performance. And what remained was simpler, more fundamental, was just consciousness, just awareness, just the experiencing self that existed before it learned to present itself to others in socially acceptable forms. Whispers tell us that this shedding was essential to Einstein's practice, that the insights his rest produced could not arrive while he was maintaining social presentation, could not emerge while he was being observed even gently, even lovingly by another consciousness. The presence of even one other person would have created obligation, would have meant part of his attention remained directed outward, monitoring, adjusting, ensuring he was being received correctly. But in solitude, complete solitude with the door closed, and no one watching, all that attention could turn inward, could be directed toward the threshold he was attempting to cross, could focus entirely on the transition from waking to sleep without any portion of awareness needing to track another's presence. The solitude was not loneliness, was not isolation in the negative sense, was not absence of connection, but different kind of connection. Connection to the depths of his own mind that could only be accessed when external connection was temporarily severed. Connection to the unconscious that spoke in whispers, so quiet they could only be heard in complete silence. Connection to the sources of insight that exist below the social self, below the verbal self, below all the layers of identity that accumulate through living in the world with others. Beneath the silence of the closed room, Einstein would feel the solitude settle around him like blanket, like atmosphere, like the necessary condition for what he was about to do. He would lie on his couch, would position the spoon, would close his eyes, and would be alone, completely alone. No one watching, no one to perform for, no one to maintain presentation for, just himself and the threshold and the practice that required this absolute aloneness to function properly. Some believe that Einstein's need for solitude extended beyond the afternoon rest, that his entire creative process required periods of complete isolation. He would take long walks alone through Princeton, would sail alone on the small boat he kept, would spend hours in his study with the door closed working through equations that no one else would see until they were finished. The solitude was not just for rest, but was condition for the kind of deep thinking his work required. In solitude, he could pursue ideas to their conclusions without having to explain them prematurely, could entertain thoughts that would have seemed crazy if spoken aloud, but that needed to be entertained if truth was to be found, could make mistakes without embarrassment, could spend hours on approaches that led nowhere without having to justify the wasted time to anyone except himself. Where memory fades into aloneness, Einstein discovered that solitude taught things that company could not, taught patience, taught self-reliance, taught how to be companion to oneself, how to find in one's own consciousness the resources that people usually seek from others: comfort, stimulation, validation, company itself. The afternoon rest in solitude was practice in being alone, daily training that made him less dependent on external input, less needy of constant social interaction, less reliant on others to provide the insights or perspective or even basic companionship that he learned to provide for himself through cultivating relationship with his own depths. Marked by the moon that shone on both populated cities and empty deserts with the same impartial light, Einstein's solitude was democratic, was universal, was the aloneness that every consciousness experiences regardless of how many people surround the body. Because consciousness itself is always alone, is always experiencing the world from a singular perspective that cannot be fully shared, is always isolated in the sense that no one else can ever fully know what it's like to be you, to see through your eyes, to feel what you feel. Einstein's afternoon solitude was acknowledgement of this fundamental condition, was acceptance that he was, in the deepest sense, always alone, and that this aloneness was not tragedy but opportunity, was not limitation but resource, was not something to escape but something to explore, to use, to dive into deliberately and see what treasures it held. It is said that in his final years, when age and illness had taken much from him, Einstein would say the afternoon rest had taught him how to be alone without being lonely, how to find in solitude not deprivation, but richness, not absence, but presence, the presence of his own consciousness attending to itself, the presence of the unconscious emerging into awareness, the presence of insights arising from the silence that only solitude could provide. The door remained closed through the afternoon hour. The solitude was absolute. And whatever occurred in that room, whatever dreams Einstein dreamed, whatever insights emerged, whatever processing the unconscious accomplished, occurred in complete aloneness. No witnesses, no observers, just one consciousness exploring its own depths, one mind learning what it could only learn when no other mind was present to influence or distract or shape the exploration. Beneath the silence that was not empty, but full of the sounds of Einstein's own breathing, the beating of his own heart, the subtle noises of a body at rest, solitude did its teaching, taught self-sufficiency, taught inner resource, taught that consciousness does not need constant external input to remain engaged, can turn inward and find their depths that are never exhausted no matter how often explored, can discover that the most interesting conversation is sometimes the one you have with yourself, that the best company can be your own when you've learned how to be alone without running from aloneness into distraction. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen, and some teachings only come to those willing to be alone with themselves, to close the door, to let silence deepen, to resist the urge to break solitude with radio or television, or any of the thousand ways modern life offers to avoid being alone with one's own mind. Einstein's afternoon solitude taught him, and through his example teaches anyone willing to try it, that the deepest rest comes not from escaping consciousness, but from being alone with it, from turning attention inward without fear or judgment, from discovering that you are enough. That consciousness attending to itself is not narcissism, but necessary practice. That solitude is not punishment, but gift. The door that closed each afternoon was door that opened inward, was boundary that protected not just rest, but the aloneness that made certain kinds of rest possible. The solitude was not incidental to Einstein's practice, but was essential component of it, was the condition without which the threshold could not be properly crossed, was the space in which consciousness could encounter itself without mediation, could rest without performing, could dream without censoring, could be whatever it was without shaping itself to meet others' expectations. And in that solitude absolute, protected, daily renewed Einstein found what only solitude provides: the presence of one's own depths, the companionship of one's own unconscious, the teaching that arrives when external voices fall silent and internal wisdom can finally be heard, the rest that restores, because it happens in the only place that true rest is possible, in the solitude, where you can finally stop being who others need you to be, and can simply be, without qualification or performance, exactly what you are. For Albert Einstein, the line between waking thought and sleeping dream was not a wall, but a membrane, not a rigid separation, but a permeable boundary that consciousness could cross in both directions, could move from thought into dream while lying on his couch each afternoon, could return from dream into thought when the spoon fell and woke him. And in the crossing, in the moment of transition itself, something became visible that could not be seen from either side alone. It is said that Einstein became expert in navigating this boundary, that through thousands of afternoon crossings, through years of paying attention to the transition from waking to sleep, he learned the geography of this threshold territory, learned to recognize when he was approaching it, learned to slow down the crossing so it didn't happen too quickly, learned to maintain some awareness even as consciousness dissolved into the hypnagogic state that precedes true sleep. The crossing always began the same way, with relaxation, with the body settling into the couch, with muscle tension releasing, with breath deepening and slowing. These physical changes were accompanied by mental changes. Thoughts that had been directed and purposeful would begin to drift, would lose their sharp edges, would start to associate more freely, jumping from one topic to another without the logic that normally governed waking thought. Einstein would notice this drift, would track it without trying to control it, would observe his own mind beginning to function differently without imposing the waking mind's demand for coherence and logic. This was the first stage of crossing, the relaxation of conscious control, the allowing of the unconscious to begin asserting itself, the thoughts becoming less like waking thoughts and more like dream thoughts, imagistic, symbolic, operating by association rather than logic. Whispers tell us that in this early stage, Einstein would sometimes see geometric patterns, shapes appearing in the darkness behind his closed eyes, circles and spirals and grids that seemed to have no source, no reason for appearing, but that captured his attention nonetheless. These were not quite dreams. He was still too awake for true dreaming, but they were not quite waking thoughts either. They existed in the boundary zone, in the threshold where waking imagery and dream imagery overlap and merge. As the crossing continued, as his body relaxed further and sleep approached more closely, the patterns would become more elaborate, would move, would transform, would arrange themselves in configurations that sometimes seemed to mean something, seemed to be showing him something, though he couldn't say what exactly. The geometric shapes would curve and fold, would exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, would display properties that waking geometry insisted were impossible, but that dream geometry accepted without question. Beneath the silence of his deepening rest, Einstein would feel his attention fragmenting, no longer focused on a single stream of thought, but scattered across multiple streams that flowed simultaneously. He might be thinking about an equation and simultaneously watching geometric patterns and simultaneously hearing music and simultaneously feeling the sensation of motion, as if he were moving through space, even though his body lay perfectly still. This was the threshold proper, the exact boundary between waking and sleep, the state where both consciousnesses, waking and dreaming, coexisted, where neither had complete dominion, where the logical mind had loosened its grip, but had not yet fully released control, where the dreaming mind had begun to assert itself, but had not yet taken over completely. Some believe this threshold state was what Einstein sought most deliberately, that the spoon was calibrated to wake him at exactly this moment, that he wanted to experience this boundary state, to inhabit it, to learn from it, because in this state, things were possible that were impossible in either full waking or full sleep. In this state, he could think with the logic of waking consciousness while also accessing the imagery of dreaming consciousness, could apply analytical faculties to dreamlike perceptions, could bring waking intelligence to bear on unconscious material, where memory fades into threshold. Einstein would sometimes catch himself crossing, would notice the exact moment when waking became sleep, when thought became dream, when the boundary was crossed. These moments were rare. Usually the crossing happened too quickly or too subtly to be noticed. But when he did catch it, when awareness was positioned exactly right to observe its own transition, something profound occurred. For a moment, consciousness was neither awake nor asleep, but was both, was observing itself from both perspectives simultaneously, was the boundary rather than being on one side or the other of it. In those moments, Einstein would understand things he couldn't understand at other times, would see connections that were invisible from either side of the boundary alone, would perceive relationships between waking logic and dream imagery, would recognize that thoughts and dreams were not opposites, but were two forms of the same thing consciousness representing reality to itself, using different grammars, but describing the same underlying territory, marked by the moon that governed the tides of consciousness as it governed the tides of the sea. The boundary between thought and dream was not fixed, but was constantly shifting, was closer some afternoons than others, was more permeable at certain times, was affected by fatigue, by what Einstein had eaten, by how deeply he had worked in the morning, by factors he could never fully track. But that changed the threshold's location and quality day by day. It is said that Einstein sometimes felt he was doing physics differently in the threshold state than when fully awake, that equations would appear not as abstractions to be manipulated, but as objects that could be seen, could be felt, could be experienced directly. That space-time was not a concept to be analyzed, but was the medium he moved through. That the curvature of space was not something to calculate, but was something he could feel in his body as he dreamed of moving through gravitational fields. These experiences were impossible to articulate, could not be captured in waking language, could not be translated directly into mathematics, but they informed his understanding nonetheless, gave him intuitions about how reality behaved, gave him confidence in equations before he had verified them, gave him the sense that physics was not just description of nature, but was participation in nature, and that participation required crossing the boundary, required letting waking thought merge with dream imagery, required inhabiting the threshold where both consciousnesses could operate simultaneously. The spoon would fall. The boundary would be marked. Einstein would return to waking consciousness, carrying fragments of what he had experienced. Images that faded quickly but left residue. Sensations that could not be named, but that shaped his subsequent thinking. The crossing complete for another day. Beneath the silence that returned as Einstein woke fully, as waking consciousness reasserted its control and dream consciousness receded, the boundary remained, was still there, could be crossed again tomorrow, would be crossed thousands more times before his practice ended, each crossing teaching something, each transition revealing what could only be seen from within the threshold itself. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen, and some truths can only be perceived from the boundary between states. Einstein's genius may have been partly his ability to inhabit that boundary, to exist in the threshold between waking and sleeping more completely than others could, to bring more awareness to the crossing, to learn from it what it came to teach, that thought and dream are not separate realms, but are parts of one continuous spectrum of consciousness, and that the deepest understanding comes not from choosing one over the other, but from learning to move fluidly between them, to cross the boundary deliberately, and with awareness, to bring back from sleep what sleep offers, and to apply to it what waking offers, creating in the synthesis something neither waking nor sleeping alone could produce. The boundary persisted. The crossing continued. And Einstein, lying on his couch with the spoon in his hand, became explorer of the threshold between thought and dream, mapping that territory through thousands of crossings, learning its geography, discovering its resources, proving that genius lives not on either side of the boundary, but in the crossing itself, in the moment of transition, in the threshold where waking meets sleeping and consciousness, balanced precisely between two states, can perceive what neither state alone could reveal. There came a time when Albert Einstein could no longer maintain his afternoon ritual. The practice that had sustained him for decades, the daily crossing of the threshold, the spoon held carefully, the hour of rest that yielded insight became difficult, then became impossible, not because he chose to stop, not because the practice had ceased to matter, but because the body that had always supported the practice was failing. was breaking down, was imposing limitations that will alone could not overcome. It is said that Einstein noticed the change gradually. That one afternoon the rest did not come as easily as before. That the spoon fell too soon before he had reached the threshold. That he woke without the familiar residue of having crossed into that other territory where understanding waited. He tried again the next day, and the next, but something had shifted. The careful calibration he had maintained for so long was becoming unstable. The spoon would fall immediately his hand releasing it before sleep approached because the muscles had weakened, could no longer maintain even the light grip that holding a spoon required. Or the spoon wouldn't fall at all, sleep coming too deeply, too quickly, his consciousness plunging past the threshold he sought without marking the crossing. And when he finally woke, it was to confusion rather than clarity, to disorientation rather than the gentle transition he had cultivated through decades of practice. Whispers tell us that Einstein tried to adapt, tried different objects, lighter ones that would fall sooner, heavier ones that could be held longer. Tried different positions, sitting instead of lying, reclining at different angles, arranging his body in ways that might allow better control. Tried different times, earlier in the afternoon, later, even attempting morning or evening rest to see if the practice could be salvaged by changing when rather than how. But nothing worked the way it had worked before. The practice was breaking down. The ritual that had been second nature for so long was becoming unpredictable, unreliable. The instrument of his consciousness, his body, his mind, the connection between them was aging in ways that made the precise navigation of the whacking sleep threshold impossible. The melancholy of this loss was profound. For Einstein, the afternoon siesta had never been just rest, had been method, had been the daily practice through which he accessed insight that waking work alone could never provide. Losing the ability to perform this practice meant losing access to sources of understanding that had guided his work for decades, meant being cut off from the depths of his own mind that could only be reached through the threshold crossing he could no longer accomplish. Beneath the silence of afternoons that now stretched unbroken, Einstein would lie on his couch and try, would close his eyes, would attempt to will himself into the state that had once come so naturally. But what was not enough, could not overcome what age and illness were doing to his body, could not force the calibration that had once been effortless. The threshold had not disappeared, it was still there, still the boundary between waking and sleeping, but his ability to navigate it with awareness had been taken from him. Some believe the loss of this practice contributed to the decline of Einstein's late work, that the final years of his life, when he was struggling to develop a unified field theory that would encompass all of physics, were hampered by his inability to access the unconscious insights that had always come through afternoon rest, that the problems he was wrestling with required the kind of understanding that only the threshold state could provide. But the threshold had become inaccessible to him. Where memory fades into absence, Einstein would sit in his study in the afternoons now, would try to work instead of rest, would push through with conscious effort when the practice that had always balanced effort with surrender was no longer available. But the work was harder. The insights came less frequently. The sense of being guided by understanding deeper than conscious thought, that sense that had characterized his earlier breakthroughs, was fading. He knew what he had lost, could remember how the practice had felt when it worked, could recall the clarity that came from crossing the threshold, could compare his current state to what he had been capable of before age and illness had stolen the practice from him. This knowing made the loss worse, made him aware of the absence in a way that someone who had never practiced would never understand. Marked by the moon that continued its cycles regardless of whether Einstein could still navigate the cycles of consciousness, the afternoons became time of mourning. Not dramatic mourning, not the grief that demands expression, but quiet sadness, the knowledge that something essential had ended, that a practice that had shaped his entire intellectual life was finished, that the partnership between his conscious and unconscious minds, mediated through daily threshold crossing, had been dissolved by forces beyond his control. It is said that Einstein tried, in those final years, to find other ways to access what the siesta had provided, would take longer walks, hoping that physical movement would stimulate the same kind of unconscious processing, would sit in silent meditation, attempting to reach inward through stillness rather than through the specific method of threshold crossing, would spend time simply staring at equations, willing them to reveal themselves the way they had once revealed themselves after afternoon rest. But these substitutions were not the same, could not be the same. The afternoon siesta had been more than just a technique for accessing the unconscious, had been ritual, had been the daily structure that organized his entire relationship with consciousness. Losing it was like losing a limb, like losing a sense, like being cut off from a world he had inhabited for decades and now could only remember but not return to. The couch remained, still in the same room, still holding the impression of his body after thousands of hours of use. But Einstein could not lie there as he once had, could not trust his body to perform the careful calibration the practice required. The couch had become monument rather than tool, evidence of what had been but could no longer be. Beneath the silence of his increasing frailty, Einstein sometimes wondered if the practice had taken something from him even as it had given so much. If the years of manipulating his consciousness, of crossing the threshold daily, of operating in states that most people never deliberately enter, if this had contributed to the breakdown. If he had worn out the mechanism through overuse, if the body and mind had limits on how often they could be asked to perform such delicate navigation, and he had exceeded those limits. But he dismissed these thoughts quickly, would not allow himself to regret the practice even if it had cost him something, because what it had given was too valuable, was too central to everything he had accomplished, was too essential to who he had become. If the practice had used him up, had consumed him in some way, well, that was price worth paying for decades of insight, for understanding that had changed physics, for access to depths of mind that most people never suspected existed. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen, and some practices, once lost, can never be fully recovered. Einstein's final years were marked by the absence of the afternoon ritual that had sustained him for so long, by the knowledge that the threshold he had learned to cross with such skill was now inaccessible, that age and illness had taken from him the practice that had been more essential to his work than any telescope or laboratory. He would sit in the afternoon now, would not even attempt to lie down, because attempting led only to failure, to the frustration of reaching for something that was no longer within reach, would occupy the hours that had once been sacred with ordinary work, or ordinary rest, or simply sitting, looking out windows at the world that continued without awareness of his loss. The practice that had defined him had ended. The ritual that had structured his relationship with consciousness was finished. The daily crossing of the threshold, the spoon in hand, the careful descent, the moment of transition, the waking with insight, all of it belonged to the past now, could be remembered but not repeated, could be mourned but not recovered. And Einstein, approaching the end of his life without the practice that had taught him how to think, how to rest, how to access the depths that made his genius possible, Einstein, discovered that some losses cannot be compensated for, that some practices are so essential that losing them means losing part of yourself, that the afternoon rest had not been addition to his life, but had been foundation of it. And now the foundation was gone, and what remained was structure without support, consciousness without the daily renewal that had kept it functioning at the levels required for the work he had devoted his life to. The afternoon that never returned, the practice that ended not with choice, but with failure of the body to support what the mind still desired, the loss that could not be fixed or worked around or replaced with substitutes, the ending that came not when Einstein was ready, but when age and illness decided for him that the practice was over, the ritual finished, the daily crossing of the threshold no longer possible, the spoon that would never fall again marking nothing but absence, but the empty space where practice had been and could never be again. The Civil War was the first American war to be extensively photographed. The technology had advanced sufficiently by 1860s that photographers could travel with armies, could capture battlefields, could document war's reality in ways that previous generations had never seen. Matthew Brady and Alexander Gardner and other photographers created visual record of the war images of camps and soldiers and battles' aftermath. The photographs were revelatory, showed war's brutality without romanticism, showed dead bodies on battlefields in ways that made war's cost visceral rather than abstract, showed ruins and devastation that words struggled to convey. But the photographers also captured emancipation, captured the transformation from slavery to freedom, captured faces and bodies that testified to bondage's cruelty and liberation's promise. These images are difficult to view even now, show suffering that words cannot fully communicate, show the human cost of slavery and the human dimension of freedom, show people in transition between what they had been forced to be and what they were becoming. One photograph stands above all others in its power to communicate slavery's horror. The image known as the scourged back shows formerly enslaved man named Gordon who had escaped from Mississippi plantation and reached Union lines in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in March 1863. Photograph shows his back, shows the scars from whippings he had endured while enslaved. The scars are extensive, are raised welts that cover his entire back, are testimony to repeated brutal beatings, are physical evidence of slavery's violence that could not be denied or minimized. The photograph was shocking when it was first published. Northern audiences who had never seen slavery's physical brutality directly were confronted with visual proof of what slavery meant. The image was widely distributed, was used by abolitionists to counter Confederate propaganda, was evidence that slavery was not a benign institution that apologists claimed, but was a system of terror and violence. The photograph showed what words could not: the physical reality of slavery's cruelty inscribed on human flesh. Gordon's face in other photographs from the same session is equally powerful, shows dignity despite degradation, shows humanity that slavery had tried to destroy but had not destroyed, shows man who had survived what should not have been survivable, shows strength that is visible in his bearing, in his direct gaze at camera, in his refusal to be diminished by what he had endured. The photographs of Gordon became icons, became among the most widely distributed images of the Civil War era, became testimony that reached people who would not read abolitionist literature, but who could not ignore visual evidence of slavery's brutality. The photographs created empathy, created understanding that words alone might not have created, made slavery's reality visceral in ways that descriptions could not achieve. Other photographs captured contraband camps where formerly enslaved people gathered after fleeing to Union lines. These images show crowded conditions, groups of people living in tents or rough shelters, lines of people waiting for food distribution, children who are too thin, adults whose faces show exhaustion and uncertainty. Photographs document the reality that emancipation brought freedom, but not abundance. That liberation meant escaping slavery, but did not mean escaping poverty or hunger, or the difficult conditions of refugee life. The contraband camp photographs show hope alongside hardship, show people who have chosen difficult freedom over secure bondage, show families that are together because they fled together, show the transition that is neither slavery nor established freedom, but is liminal space between. The photographs are testimony to emancipation's complexity, to liberation that is real but is difficult, to freedom that is chosen despite its challenges, to people who are surviving despite inadequate resources. Photographs of Black soldiers show transformation of different kind, show formerly enslaved men in Union uniforms, bearing arms, standing in military formation, showing discipline and dignity and martial bearing. The photographs were powerful statement, were visual proof that Black men could be soldiers, could fight courageously, could serve with honor. The photographs challenged racist assumptions that Black people were incapable of military service, showed that formerly enslaved people would fight for their freedom, showed that they deserved respect and recognition. The images of Black soldiers were used by advocates for Black suffrage, the argument being that those who fought for union deserved political rights, that military service earned citizenship, that men who risked their lives for nation should have voice in nation's governance. The photographs made that argument visually, made it undeniable through showing Black soldiers' courage and capability. But the photographs also revealed continuing racism. Black soldiers were often photographed in support roles rather than combat roles, were shown digging trenches or loading supplies more often than shown in battle formations. The photographic record reflected how Black soldiers were often assigned labor rather than combat, were treated as inferior despite their service. The photographs also show the separate and unequal nature of Black military service, the lower pay, the inferior equipment, the segregated units. The visual record documents both the achievement of Black military service and the discrimination that accompanied that service, shows both the transformation and its limits, shows both the progress and the persistent inequality. Family photographs from the era show formerly enslaved people asserting their personhood through having their images captured. Photography was expensive, was luxury that enslaved people had not been able to afford. Being photographed was act of self-assertion, was claiming visibility, was insisting on being seen and remembered. Families would save money to have portraits made, would dress in their best clothing, would pose formally to show dignity and respectability. These photographs were important to families, were proof of freedom, were assertion of humanity, were evidence that they existed as persons rather than as property. The photographs would be treasured, would be preserved, would be passed down through generations, would become connection between descendants and ancestors, would be visual testimony to survival and to transformation from slavery to freedom. The photographs that documented emancipation show what words struggled to convey the physical evidence of slavery's brutality. The faces of people in transition between bondage and freedom, the dignity that persisted despite degradation, the hope that survived despite suffering, the families that stayed together despite everything trying to tear them apart. The images are preserved now in archives and museums, are available digitally. can be viewed by anyone who seeks them, but the images remain difficult to view, remain testimony to suffering that should not have happened, remain evidence of cruelty that cannot be explained away, remain faces that demand recognition, that insist on being seen, that refuse to let us forget what slavery was and what emancipation meant to those who experienced it. The photographs showed what words could not, showed scars that testified to brutality, showed faces that showed humanity, showed conditions that revealed emancipation's complexity, showed soldiers who proved capability, showed families who asserted personhood through being photographed. The images were powerful because they were specific, because they showed individuals rather than abstractions, because they made slavery and emancipation concrete rather than theoretical, because they created empathy through showing actual people rather than describing generic enslaved people. The photographs mattered, created understanding that words alone might not have created, made visual argument that supplemented verbal argument, provided evidence that could not be denied. The photographs, the images, the visual testimony, forever preserved, forever powerful, forever showing what words could not fully convey, forever faces that demand to be seen, forever testimony to slavery's cruelty and emancipation's promise and the human cost of both. The photographs, forever witness, forever testament, forever showing the truth that history must not forget. Forever. When Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1, 1863, when his pen touched parchment and made the promise real, when the document was sealed and distributed and published in newspapers across the nation, there were states where the proclamation did not apply, were states where enslaved people remained enslaved despite the Declaration of Freedom, were territories where slavery continued legally, where masters maintained their authority, where bondage persisted even as liberation was proclaimed elsewhere. These were the exempted states, the border states that had remained loyal to Union, the parts of Confederacy already under Union occupation, the areas where Lincoln believed he lacked authority to free enslaved people, or where he feared that freeing them would undermine Union cause. Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, Delaware, parts of Louisiana, parts of Virginia, all of Tennessee. In these places, emancipation did not come on January 1, 1863, would come later, would come through different mechanisms, would come only after delay that meant some enslaved people would remain in bondage for 2 more years, while people in other states were freed. Kentucky was largest of the exempted border states in terms of enslaved population, had approximately 225,000 enslaved people in 1860, was deeply divided state where Union sentiment was strong enough to keep state from seceding, but where slavery's hold was equally strong. Lincoln had been careful with Kentucky, had overruled generals who tried to free enslaved people there, had promised Kentucky Unionists that he would not interfere with slavery in exchange for their continued loyalty. The Emancipation Proclamation kept that promise, exempted Kentucky entirely, allowed slavery to continue there throughout 1863 and 1864 and into 1865. For enslaved people in Kentucky, the proclamation brought no immediate change, brought only knowledge that people across the river in Tennessee were being declared free while they remained enslaved, brought the bitter understanding that their liberation was sacrificed for sake of maintaining Kentucky's loyalty to Union. Kentucky's exemption created exodus. Enslaved people fled across state lines to claim freedom that was denied them in Kentucky, crossed into Tennessee where proclamation applied, made their way to Union military camps, enlisted in Army once black military service was authorized. The flight emptied some Kentucky plantations, undermined slavery's functioning even though slavery remained legal. Kentucky slaveholders complained, demanded that federal government stop the flight, demanded that enslaved people who fled be returned. But Union policy after proclamation was not to return people who claimed freedom under proclamation's terms. The policy did not technically apply to Kentucky, since Kentucky was exempted. But practically, Union forces were not going to recapture people who had fled from Kentucky into areas where proclamation had declared them free. The contradiction revealed absurdity of geographic limitations on emancipation, revealed that maintaining slavery in Kentucky while freeing people in Tennessee created untenable situation where enslaved people in Kentucky could claim freedom simply by crossing state line. Missouri had smaller enslaved population, approximately 115,000 in 1860, but was deeply divided state where guerrilla warfare between Union and Confederate sympathizers was brutal. Lincoln had worked to keep Missouri in Union, had again overruled generals who tried to free enslaved people there, had prioritized Missouri's loyalty over emancipation. The proclamation exempted Missouri just as it exempted Kentucky. Slavery continued there legally, but Missouri's situation differed from Kentucky's because Missouri had stronger anti-slavery movement, had significant population of German immigrants who opposed slavery, had political movement toward gradual emancipation that had begun before the war. The movement accelerated during war. Missouri held constitutional convention in 1865 and abolished slavery through state constitution, effective immediately. The abolition came in January 1865, 2 years after the proclamation, but came before 13th Amendment forced emancipation. Missouri freed its enslaved population voluntarily, making the exemption temporary and ultimately meaningless. Maryland was closer to Washington, was state whose loyalty was essential because losing Maryland would have meant Washington was surrounded by Confederate territory. Lincoln had been particularly careful with Maryland, had suspended habeas corpus there to prevent secession, had arrested pro-Confederate legislators, had done whatever was necessary to keep Maryland in Union. The proclamation exempted Maryland from emancipation, but Maryland, like Missouri, had growing anti-slavery movement, had free black population that was larger than enslaved population by 1860, had economic shift away from plantation agriculture that made slavery less central to states' economy. Maryland held referendum in 1864 on constitutional amendment abolishing slavery. The referendum was controversial, was contested, but abolition won narrowly. Maryland freed its enslaved people, approximately 87,000, in November 1864, more than a year after proclamation, but before 13th Amendment. The state action made Maryland's exemption from proclamation temporary. Delaware was smallest border state, had smallest enslaved population, fewer than 2,000 people in 1860, was state where slavery was dying already due to economic changes, was state where gradual emancipation seemed inevitable even without war. But Delaware was also most conservative border state on slavery issue, rejected repeated attempts at compensated emancipation, voted against 13th Amendment when it was first proposed, maintained slavery legally until 13th Amendment was ratified in December 1865. For small number of enslaved people in Delaware, freedom came not from proclamation, not from state action, but only from constitutional amendment that forced abolition even in states that resisted. Delaware's enslaved people were among last to be freed, remained in bondage until December 1865, nearly 3 years after proclamation. The exempted parts of Confederate states created different problems. New Orleans and 13 Louisiana parishes under Union control were exempted from proclamation. So were parts of Virginia designated as future West Virginia. So was all of Tennessee. The exemptions were strategic. Lincoln believed he lacked authority to free enslaved people in areas already under Union control because they were not in active rebellion, believed that freeing them might undermine Unionist sentiment in those areas, believed that military necessity argument that justified proclamation in Confederate-controlled territory did not apply where Union already held control. But the exemptions created absurdities, created situations where enslaved people in New Orleans under Union occupation remained enslaved, while enslaved people in Confederate-controlled Louisiana were declared free, created Union soldiers being present in areas where slavery continued, created mockery of emancipation as liberation. How could Union claim to be fighting for freedom while tolerating slavery in areas it controlled? The contradictions created pressure, created moral questions that could not be ignored, created practical problems as enslaved people in exempted areas fled to non-exempted areas to claim freedom, created political pressure from radical Republicans who demanded universal emancipation, created situations that were unsustainable. The pressure led to changes, led Union military authorities in exempted areas to often treat enslaved people as free regardless of proclamation's text, led to state action in border states, led ultimately to 13th Amendment, which made all exemptions irrelevant by abolishing slavery everywhere. But in 1863 and 1864, the exemptions meant that hundreds of thousands of enslaved people remained in bondage, meant that emancipation was incomplete, meant that Union was fighting to end slavery while tolerating slavery, meant that proclamation's promise was limited by political calculation. For enslaved people in exempted states, the proclamation brought complicated emotions, brought knowledge that liberation was possible because it had been declared elsewhere, brought hope that emancipation would eventually reach them, but also brought despair at being excluded, brought bitter understanding that their freedom was sacrificed for political reasons, brought awareness that geography determined their status in ways that made no moral sense. Some responded by fleeing, by crossing borders to claim freedom that was denied in their home states. Some responded by waiting, by hoping that circumstances would change, that proclamation would be extended, that state action would bring freedom. Some responded by increasing resistance, by working more slowly, by refusing certain tasks, by making slavery's functioning more difficult, even while it remained legal. The responses varied, but the underlying reality was same. The states that did not free created ongoing bondage for people who heard that slavery was ending, but found that it was not ending for them. The states that did not free revealed proclamations, nature as war measure and political strategy, rather than as universal human rights declaration, revealed that Lincoln's emancipation was calculated to achieve military and political objectives, rather than to fulfill moral imperative of ending slavery everywhere, revealed that some enslaved people were sacrificed for sake of maintaining Union coalition, revealed that geography determined freedom in ways that exposed the compromised nature of emancipation. The revelation does not diminish proclamation's importance, does not make it less significant, but does require acknowledging that proclamation was incomplete, that liberation was partial, that hundreds of thousands remained enslaved despite January 1, 1863. That full emancipation required additional years and additional actions and ultimately constitutional amendment. The states that did not free, the slavery that continued, the bondage that persisted despite proclamation, the exemptions that revealed emancipation's limitations, forever part of proclamation's story, forever evidence of its compromised nature, forever reminder that January 1, 1863 was beginning rather than completion, was promise that required years to fulfill, was declaration that left work unfinished, the states that did not free, the bondage that continued, the emancipation that was incomplete, forever testimony to the gap between proclamation and fulfillment, forever. In the plantation houses across the South, in the columned mansions that symbolized wealth built on enslaved labor, in the rooms where masters lived in comfort, subsidized by bondage, the Emancipation Proclamation brought fear. not moral fear, not fear of having committed wrong and now facing reckoning, but practical fear, fear of economic collapse, fear of social transformation, fear of losing control, fear of possible vengeance from those who had been enslaved. The fear was rooted in guilty knowledge, in understanding that the enslaved had every reason to hate those who had enslaved them, had every reason to seek revenge for cruelties endured, had every justification for violence against system that had been violent toward them for centuries. The masters feared what they knew they deserved, feared that emancipation would bring retribution, feared that the power they had wielded would be turned against them. The fear was not sympathetic, was fear of losing power to exploit and oppress, was fear of facing consequences for wrongs committed. But the fear was real, was visible in how masters responded to proclamation, was evident in the measures they took to try to maintain control, even as control was slipping away. The economic fear was immediate. The entire Southern economy was built on enslaved labor. Plantation agriculture, cotton primarily, but also tobacco, rice, sugar, was profitable only because labor costs were zero, because enslaved people could be worked without compensation, because the system extracted maximum labor at minimal cost. Emancipation threatened to destroy this. If enslaved people became free, they would demand wages, would have to be compensated for labor, would transform from asset to expense. The economic model that had made plantation owners wealthy would collapse. The masters understood this, understood that emancipation meant economic catastrophe for them, meant losing not just property in enslaved people, which represented most of their wealth, but losing the ability to operate plantations profitably. The fear was of poverty, of losing everything, of economic ruin that emancipation would bring. But the fear was also social. The Southern social system was built on racial hierarchy, was built on white supremacy maintained through slavery. White people were dominant. Black people were subordinate. The hierarchy was enforced through law and custom and violence. Emancipation threatened to destroy this hierarchy. If enslaved people became free, if they gained rights, if they achieved equality, then the entire social order would collapse. The masters feared this more than they feared economic loss, feared the social leveling that emancipation implied, feared being forced to treat formerly enslaved people as equals, feared the collapse of social distinctions that had defined their world. The fear was of social chaos. of world turned upside down, of former slaves becoming equals or even superiors, of losing social status that slavery had guaranteed. The fear of violence was perhaps most acute. The masters knew what slavery had been, knew the cruelties that had been inflicted, knew the whippings and brandings and separations and sexual violence and all the horrors that slavery entailed, knew that enslaved people had reason to hate, had reason to seek vengeance, had justification for violence against those who had enslaved them. The masters feared slave revolts, feared that emancipation would bring violence, feared that formerly enslaved people would rise up and kill their former masters. The fear was rooted in Haiti, in the Haitian Revolution, where enslaved people had successfully overthrown their enslavers and had killed many white slaveholders in the process. The example of Haiti haunted Southern slaveholders was constant reminder that enslaved people could and would fight for freedom if given opportunity. The Emancipation Proclamation seemed to give that opportunity, seemed to authorize and encourage enslaved people to rise against masters. The fear was that Union Army would arm enslaved people, would support slave revolts, would use emancipation to unleash violence against white Southerners. The masters responded to fear through increased control, through tighter surveillance of enslaved people, through restricting movement and gathering, through trying to prevent information about proclamation from reaching enslaved people. Some masters never told enslaved people about proclamation, maintained fiction that nothing had changed, worked enslaved people as before, punished resistance as before, tried to preserve slavery through ignorance reasoning that if enslaved people did not know they were declared free, they would continue to accept bondage. The strategy worked temporarily in some places, particularly in areas remote from Union armies where news traveled slowly. But the strategy ultimately failed because information could not be completely controlled. The grapevine telegraph carried news. Runaway enslaved people returned with information. Union Army advancement brought the news directly. The attempts to maintain ignorance could delay, but could not prevent enslaved people from learning about proclamation. Some masters fled, took enslaved people, and moved deeper into Confederacy, moved away from advancing Union armies, moved to areas where Union forces had not yet reached, and where slavery might be preserved longer. The flight was attempt to maintain bondage despite proclamation, was refusal to accept that slavery was ending, was determination to hold on to enslaved people as property for as long as possible. Some enslaved people were forced to flee, with masters were taken against their will deeper into confederacy, were separated from family members who refused to go or who escaped during flight. The forced removal was violence, was attempt to prevent enslaved people from claiming freedom that proclamation had declared, was effort to extend bondage beyond its legal ending. Some enslaved people escaped during these forced removals, fled to Union lines, claimed freedom that masters were trying to deny. But some were unable to escape, were carried into remote areas where they remained enslaved until Union armies finally arrived, or until 13th Amendment ended slavery completely. Some masters became more brutal, increased punishments, increased surveillance, increased violence. The brutality was attempt to maintain control through terror, was effort to prevent enslaved people from fleeing or resisting, was demonstration that masters still had power despite proclamation, was retaliation against enslaved people for Union's emancipation policy. The violence intensified in many places after proclamation. Masters who feared losing control exercised what control remained through increased cruelty. The violence testified to slavery's true nature, was always system maintained through terror, was always brutality dressed as paternalism, was always violence underlying every aspect of master-slave relationship. The proclamation stripped away pretense, revealed that slavery was not benevolent institution, but was coercion that would respond to threat of emancipation with increased brutality. The fear in plantation houses was also fear of future, fear of what South would become if emancipation succeeded, fear of world where Black people were free, fear of having to imagine different social order, fear of changes that seemed unimaginable to people who had known only slavery. The fear was of unknown, of future that could not be predicted, of transformation that was too large to comprehend. The masters had built their entire world on slavery, had organized economy and society and identity around racial hierarchy and enslaved labor. Emancipation threatened everything they knew, everything they valued, everything they believed about themselves and their world. The fear was existential, was fear of world ending, of everything familiar dissolving, of having to exist in world organized according to principles they rejected. The fear was not noble, was not sympathetic, was fear of losing unjust power, fear of facing consequences of having benefited from slavery, fear of having to live in a world where Black people had rights and dignity and equality. But the fear was also revealed that masters knew slavery was wrong even while defending it, knew that enslaved people hated bondage even while claiming enslaved people were content, knew that the system was maintained only through violence even while claiming it was benevolent, knew that emancipation threatened them because they had committed wrongs that deserved retribution even while claiming they had done no wrong. The fear testified to guilty knowledge, to understanding that slavery was indefensible, to recognition that the system would not survive without coercion. The fear lived in plantation houses, lived in the silence when masters wondered what enslaved people were thinking, lived in the increased guards and patrols, lived in the violence that tried to maintain control, lived in the flight deeper into Confederacy, lived in all the desperate measures masters took to try to preserve system that was dying. The fear that lived in plantation houses, fear of economic collapse, fear of social transformation, fear of violence, fear of future, fear rooted in guilty knowledge that they deserved what they feared. The fear, the desperate attempts to maintain control, the violence that intensified, the flight that delayed but could not prevent emancipation. All testimony to slavery's true nature, all revelation that proclamation had changed everything even where it could not be immediately enforced. The fear, forever revealing, forever testimony to guilt that masters carried, forever evidence of the system's violence, the fear that lived in plantation houses. Forever, the Confederate government never acknowledged the Emancipation Proclamation's legitimacy, never accepted that Abraham Lincoln, President of Nation, they had seceded from, leader they did not recognize as having authority over them, had any right to declare enslaved people in Confederate states free, never treated proclamation as valid law, never acted as if January 1, 1863 had changed anything legally. The Confederate silence on proclamation's legitimacy was absolute, was deliberate, was strategy of denial designed to maintain fiction that slavery was secure, that Confederate independence meant Confederate control over domestic institutions, including slavery, that Union pronouncements about emancipation were meaningless interference in Confederate affairs. Jefferson Davis, Confederate president, denounced proclamation as war crime, declared that it was attempting to incite slave insurrection, threatened that Union soldiers captured, while implementing emancipation, would be treated as criminals rather than as prisoners of war. But underneath, the denunciation was silence about legitimacy, was refusal to engage with proclamation on its terms, was insistence that it simply did not apply because Confederacy did not recognize Union authority. The Confederate Congress continued passing laws regarding slavery as if proclamation had not happened, continued regulating slave patrols, continued addressing issues of slave property and fugitive slaves, continued maintaining legal framework for slavery as if system was permanent and secure. The legislative activity was partly practical slavery, did continue in areas beyond Union control, did require continued legal framework. But the activity was also psychological, was attempt to maintain normalcy, was refusal to acknowledge that slavery's days were numbered, was insistence through legislative action that Confederacy would preserve slavery regardless of Union proclamations. The laws passed after January 1, 1863, regarding slavery were fantasy disguised as legislation, were attempts to preserve through law what military reality was destroying. Confederate newspapers denounced proclamation, published editorials condemning Lincoln's action, accused Union of attempting to incite race war, warned of the violence that emancipation would unleash, predicted that formerly enslaved people would murder white Southerners in their beds, used every racist argument available to portray emancipation as catastrophe. But the denunciations revealed anxiety more than confidence, revealed that Confederacy understood that proclamation was a significant threat, that emancipation would undermine Confederate war effort, that slavery, the institution Confederacy had succeeded to preserve, was being destroyed despite Confederate resistance. The newspaper's outrage testified to proclamation's power, testified that despite Confederate refusal to acknowledge legitimacy, the proclamation was having effect, was transforming the war, was undermining slavery, was threatening everything Confederacy was fighting for. But Confederate government also understood reality, understood that proclamation was encouraging enslaved people to flee, understood that Union Army advancement meant emancipation's enforcement, understood that slaves were becoming soldiers in Union Army, understood that the institution they had succeeded to preserve was collapsing. The understanding led to desperate measures. Confederate Congress debated late in the war, when defeat was approaching, whether to arm enslaved men and promise them freedom in exchange for military service. The debate was admission that slavery was dying, was recognition that Confederacy might have to choose between preserving slavery and surviving as nation. The debate ultimately resulted in authorization for Black Confederate troops in March 1865, too late to matter militarily, but symbolically significant as acknowledgement that slavery could not be maintained even by government that had been created to preserve it. The silence about proclamation's legitimacy was also silence about reality. Confederate officials maintained publicly that slavery was secure even as plantations emptied, maintained that enslaved people were loyal even as they fled to Union lines by thousands, maintained that system was functioning even as it collapsed. The silence was denial, was refusal to acknowledge that proclamation was working, that emancipation was succeeding, that slavery was ending despite Confederate resistance. The denial continued until the end, until Confederate armies surrendered, until Confederate government dissolved, until slavery ended completely with 13th Amendment. Throughout, Confederate government maintained fiction that Union had no right to free enslaved people. That proclamation was illegitimate. That slavery would be preserved in Confederate states if Confederacy won independence. The fiction became less and less tenable as war progressed. But fiction was maintained because acknowledging reality would mean acknowledging that Confederacy was failing in its primary purpose. Confederate military policy reflected the silence and the denial. Confederate Army treated Black Union soldiers not as legitimate prisoners of war, but as rebellious slaves subject to execution or re-enslavement. The policy was an attempt to delegitimize Black military service, to deny that formerly enslaved people had right to fight for their freedom, to maintain that Black people remained property despite Union claims of freedom. The policy led to atrocities. The Fort Pillow Massacre in April 1864, where Confederate forces killed Black soldiers who had surrendered, was most notorious example. But similar violence occurred throughout the war. Was Confederate attempt to use terror to prevent Black military service, to make emancipation's military dimension too costly for Union to continue. The policy failed. Black soldiers continued enlisting, continued fighting courageously. continued proving that formerly enslaved people would fight for freedom despite Confederate threats. But the policy revealed Confederate desperation, revealed that silence about proclamation's legitimacy masked fear that proclamation was succeeding. The silence was also practical impossibility. Confederacy could refuse to acknowledge proclamation's legitimacy, could pass laws maintaining slavery, could insist that enslaved people remained property, but could not prevent Union armies from advancing, could not prevent enslaved people from fleeing, could not prevent proclamation from being implemented in areas that came under Union control. The gap between Confederate legal position and military reality grew wider as war progressed. Confederate legal framework maintained slavery even as actual slavery was collapsing. The contradiction became untenable, became absurd, became testimony to the failure of Confederate silence to prevent what the silence denied. The laws maintained slavery. The reality destroyed slavery. The silence could not bridge the gap between legal fiction and actual fact. By 1865, as Confederate defeat approached, the silence was breaking, was giving way to recognition that slavery was dying. That proclamation had succeeded even if Confederacy never acknowledged its legitimacy. That emancipation was becoming reality regardless of Confederate denial. Some Confederates began acknowledging openly what had been known privately, that slavery was ending, that Confederacy had failed to preserve it, that the institution they had seceded to protect was being destroyed despite everything they had done. The acknowledgement came too late, came only after defeat was certain, but came nonetheless. The silence of the Confederacy, the refusal to acknowledge proclamation's legitimacy, the denial that maintained legal fiction while military reality destroyed slavery, the laws that continued regulating institution that was collapsing, the newspapers that denounced what they could not prevent, the military policy that tried to delegitimize black soldiers, the desperate late-war debate about arming enslaved people, all testimony to Confederate failure to preserve slavery despite having created nation explicitly to preserve it. The silence revealed more than acknowledgement would have revealed. Revealed the desperation, revealed the denial, revealed the gap between what Confederacy claimed and what Confederacy could achieve. The silence of the Confederacy, forever testimony to proclamation's success despite Confederate resistance, forever evidence that emancipation could not be prevented by refusing to acknowledge its legitimacy, forever proof that slavery died despite everything Confederacy did to preserve it. The silence, the denial, the failure, forever.